Hello, and welcome to this panel discussion on the Biden-Putin summit, brought to you by the Center for the National Interest. I'm Sarah Miller-Beebe, former Director for Russian Affairs on the National Security Council staff, and I'll be moderating today's discussion. We have an outstanding panel of experts with us today to help us interpret the results of the meeting that took place in Geneva just yesterday. John Herbst is director of the Eurasia Center at the Atlantic Council and a former US ambassador to Ukraine. Fyodor Lukyanov is chairman of the Presidium of Russia's Council on Foreign and Defense Policy, editor-in-chief of Russia in Global Affairs, and research director of the Valdai Discussion Club. Douglas McGregor is a decorated combat veteran, the author of 5 books, and a former senior advisor to the US Secretary of Defense. And Dimitri Simes is president and CEO of the Center for the National Interest. We'll begin today with a short series of opening remarks by each of our 4 panelists, and then I'll open the discussion to questions from our audience. You may submit those questions in written form using the question icon at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Without further ado, let's begin. Ambassador Herbst, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you. I think the summit was a moderately important event in the development of US-Russian relations. Certainly the most visible, but the most important data points in the relationship are the series of action taken by President Biden since he entered the White House and President Putin in the months preceding the summit, and then of course what's to come after the summit. Biden seemed to make clear early on in his administration that he was going to in fact push back against what I consider to be a revisionist Kremlin foreign policy. And he demonstrated that very well in reaction to the Kremlin military buildup along Ukraine's border at the east and in northern Crimea. We had a remarkable week of US diplomacy in April when every senior US national security official called his or her Ukrainian equivalent and expressed strong American support for Ukraine in face of this Kremlin provocation. Biden himself called Zelensky to deliver that message. And just to make sure the message was received elsewhere, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Milley, called his Russian counterpart to make sure that Moscow understood American support for Ukraine. That to me was a very important data point, but sadly not the only one that preceded the summit. Starting with the president's misbegotten decision to waive sanctions on Nord Stream 2, a gesture to Merkel, a concession to Merkel, but in fact also a gift to Putin, underscored by the fact that they made that decision on the day that Blinken met with Lavrov. And then the administration's very weak response or non-response to a series of Russian cyber attacks on the United States. And then finally, the coincidence of a major Russian naval exercise not far from Hawaii as the summit was proceeding, all projected Kremlin strength and American weakness. Now, Biden partly adjusted his position, which was a good thing. One, by writing a sensible op-ed in the Washington Post outlining his, I would say, tough-minded approach to the Kremlin. And more importantly, the series of summits that preceded the meeting in Geneva, meaning the G7, the NATO summit, meetings with the European Union, where Biden underscored that he had the whole democratic world behind him as he went in to see Mr. Putin. But frankly, the Kremlin understands actions more than words, and the actions that I described already, again, projected American weakness. So I was a bit concerned about the summit. However, the summit, from my standpoint, turned out rather well. The sides did talk about those areas where they can cooperate, and I am all for example, a dialogue on nuclear arms control. But more importantly, Mr. Biden gave Mr. Putin to understand that if his provocations, especially in the cyber sphere, continue, there will be a strong American response. And the fact that Biden put a big question mark over the summit when he said, I have no idea whether this summit is successful, I'll know in a few months, was a way of making clear to the Kremlin that if its revisionist foreign policy continues, a strong American response will likewise follow. And that to me is the most important thing. So we'll see what happens in the months ahead. And in the meantime, we have this dialogue on strategic stability, which I am all for. but again, a dialogue based upon American willingness to stand strong in the face of Mr. Putin's provocative foreign policy. So I'm sure I've given our other guests something to think about and to shoot at in the discussion to follow. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Herbst. Dr. Lukyanov, how do things look from your vantage point?
Yeah, thank you very much for this invitation. That's a fantastic opportunity to exchange views just 24 hours after the summit has been completed. First of all, what I noticed in Russian reaction, official reaction, and also public reaction, the majority of commentators, it's very positive. So on the highest level, we heard today very positive words personally about President Biden. On the level of those who used to try to find sensations, be it independent journalists or those who are more involved in propaganda creation. This time we hear a very sober analysis of what happened, and basically a positive assessment of the foundation which has been laid. Of course, as Ambassador Herbst said, no one can be sure that the moderate success of this meeting will be extended to the next phase, and we leave not only because of problems on American or Russian side, but also because we live in the international environment which successfully can destroy basically everything in one moment. And in this regard, we only should pray that professionals on both sides will have enough time to at least to launch this work, which was agreed yesterday. In general, I think the most frequently used parallel here is that we are back to the Cold War period, but it might sound paradoxically in a positive sense, because the worst time, the worst period in our relationship is hopefully behind, because of course the chaotic and partially hysterical confrontation which we witnessed in recent years, especially during the administration of President Trump, that was the worst possible mode of relationship between two nuclear superpowers. The worst possible, not because it was bad relationship, but because it was to a large extent irrational relationship. Now we are back to a rational confrontation, to put it in this way. This confrontation has agenda, and I personally see the main idea and main point of yesterday's summit in framing this agenda. Framing, as both Putin and Biden mentioned, framing the possibility to formulate new rules of behavior. There is no illusion, neither on American nor on the Russian side, that relationship will improve. It was not about to improve relationship, it was about to structure them, to give them some kind of rationale. And at least at the highest level, they managed to do it. Now, what is, of course, absolutely crucial, whether professionals on both sides will be able to get rid of inertia, which they got during previous years, inertia to see any move of the opposite side as a move directed against vis-a-vis. I think that this is unfortunately the problem both for Russia and the United States, but in recent years a little bit more for the United States, to be a little bit self-obsessed, to see any move by the other side as directed against us. In Russia, unfortunately, we have this tradition. In the United States, this is something new. I hope that specialists in strategic stability, in cybersecurity, in regional issues, they will be able to start to sort out, to see real motives behind different moves, because in today's environment, many moves are motivated by completely different things. And of course, we should remember, I think specialists know that, but media people sometimes forget about this. US-Russian relationship is not the core of international relations today. It is not the situation like it used to be during the initial Cold War, when Moscow and Washington, rightly or wrongly, but they could define what was going on in the world affairs. It's not the case anymore. It's not the case for Russia. It's not the case for the United States. I think that Putin and Biden demonstrated they are solid and reasonable enough to launch this overview of not just relationship between Russia and the United States, which is of course very important, but first of all, to understand real strategies for respective countries in the new international environment, which is changing anyway, which is changing in parallel with our relationship. And I think, frankly, that on the American side now with Biden, we see more clarity for the strategy. Whether its strategy will be successful or not, that's another debate, but I think Mr. Biden knows very well what he wants to achieve at the next stage. On the Russian side, we definitely see beginning of the profound review of international stance, but this is just at the beginning. I think we will need to make a lot of homework, actually disconnected from the United States, to understand real possibilities and limits for Russian foreign policy in years to come.
Thank you so much, Dr. Lukyanov. So, Colonel McGregor, from your perspective as a military strategist, how do you view the outcome of the summit?
Well, I'll try to be brief. First, I agree with the previous speakers on the topic of strategic arms reduction talks. This administration broke with its predecessor quickly on start, which I think was the right thing to do. And we can hope that there will be some arrangement that emerges over the months ahead that allows both of us to stop spending quite as much money as we are on nuclear weapons. But that remains to be seen. But the fact that we're now going to talk about it seriously is a good thing. Other than that, I don't really think there is anything new. I think, on the contrary, this was sort of a restoration of attitudes and policies towards Russia by the United States that predated Mr. Trump's 4 years. And despite his efforts, not much changed on his watch. I don't know, as a Russian, if I would see that as necessarily very positive. I don't see any evidence of a willingness to see anything through the lens of Russian national security interests. We tend to view everything as we always have, as we somehow or another are the men in the white hats and the Russians are the fellows in the black hats, and that hasn't changed. What I think is important, though, about the last few weeks is something that Ambassador Herbst pointed out, and that is that the German Nord Stream 2 outcome is very, very important for Europeans. I say that because it's tangible, concrete evidence of the fact that the Germans certainly do not regard the Russians as an imminent military threat. I think more Europeans fall into that camp than we realize. And that certainly doesn't add cohesion to the North Atlantic Alliance in any way, shape, or form. I don't think Mr. Putin missed that. Mr. Putin needs the cash. The Germans need the liquefied gas, not only the Germans, the Danes, the Dutch, the Austrians, and many others in Central East Europe. I think that's going to continue. The Germans want to reduce their dependence on nuclear power. I think that was a very important dynamic that deserves more attention. Because I think people in the United States will ask why we are so concerned about committing our forces in Europe when Europeans collectively don't seem to see a serious threat from Russia that is military.
Thank you very much. That is a unique perspective that's not often voiced. Mr. Simes.
I agree with everybody that the meeting was a moderate success. At least I don't see any particular harm. I think it was civilized. I think there was a modicum, if you wish, of rational thinking and practical approach in dialogue between Putin and Biden. I was encouraged by how the two presidents spoke about each other, not with any misplaced warmth, not with any sentimental idealism, but just as two leaders should speak to each other if they're prepared to conduct serious negotiations. I think that it probably is good that now in the US-Russian discussion, there is a possibility to have dialogue even on the highest level without being accused of betraying American interests and values. You could see that some in the US press corps were taking even President Biden as being not sufficiently loyal to American principles. But I think in terms of overall political environment in the United States, I think having this encounter and having it a kind of normal and civilized was constructive for the character of American political discourse. But clearly it's not going to change the relationship fundamentally. Clearly both countries will remain adversaries. Clearly the best with current approaches we may have is a managed competition. And of course, if you are having a boxing match, it's good if you have a referee, if there are certain rules, but still a boxing match. It's not a chess match and it's not a party. Having said that, I have a somewhat different view from other participants, because I don't take American attitude to Russia, or more broadly, attitude to US foreign policy as a given. We just recently had the president who had a very different attitude, who did not see that it was most important to the United States to create a united front with Europe, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand, a united front of democracies. Even if we simultaneously were pushing Russia and China closer together, and we're creating a new alliance of major powers against the United States and against American allies. If you have to compare the danger of Russia miscalculating on, let's say, Latvia, and a danger of creating two competing alliances of major nuclear powers, where Russia would be closer and closer to an economic giant like China, and these two powers would dominate Eurasia. Well, you know, if you think about strategy, that sounds like a strategic nightmare. I also have to say that it's not given in my mind that we should view a relationship with Russia through the prism of Russian attitude to countries like Poland or Baltic states, particularly through the prism of the Russian relationship with Ukraine. It was exactly what President Washington was advising Americans against, becoming too much involved with European squabbles and perceiving local disagreements and historic rivalry against European states, perceiving them as a moral drama, as something that necessarily required American involvement. Let me say, if you look, for instance, and I don't want to be long, if you look, for instance, at the situation with Crimea, I completely agree with those who say that the infamous referendum where the residents of Crimea voted for joining Russia, how to put it delicately, was a little short on legitimacy. And I understand why Ukraine would want Crimea back. What I don't understand, why it should become an important principle for the United States and the American allies. After all, there was another referendum which was no more problematic than the Crimean referendum in 2014. I'm talking about a referendum in Ukraine in 1991, which was in favor of Ukrainian independence. That referendum was also never negotiated with Central Federal Authorities. It also was a referendum which was not in compliance with the Russian federal law. It was a referendum which also was a violation of Soviet constitution, as the Crimean referendum was a violation, obviously, of Ukrainian constitution. The point I am trying to make is that the United States, if you are looking at President Trump's approach to international relations, or going back to more conventional statesmen like Nixon, like Kissinger, the United States may want to look at its real strategic interests. And the United States may want to look at real history, not what happened yesterday, but what happened before that, to create a proper context for assessing not just Russian behavior, but American interests. And I'm not too optimistic that such a dialogue, such a debate would start in the United States tomorrow. But I actually think that this is possible, and I hope more likely than most think, because otherwise I am afraid the United States may find itself in a real strategic peril.
Thank you, Dimitri. So I'm going to open to questions from our audience, and to remind you, you can submit questions by using that question icon at the bottom of your Zoom screens. Ambassador Herbst, you look like you'd like to respond potentially to what Mr. Simes was just saying. I'll give you the floor for a couple of minutes to do that.
All right. I'm second to no one in appreciating the importance and the wisdom of George Washington. But his views on entangling alliances could also have been used against establishing NATO at the end of World War II. And the establishment of NATO was absolutely essential to providing both security and ultimately prosperity for the entire world over the past 75 years. Point one. Point two, on Crimea. I see a way to manage and improve US-Russian relations and American security and European security while pushing Crimea to the side. We all know that the major sanctions placed on Moscow are not Crimea related, they are Donbass related. So when Mr. Putin decides, and some point Russia will decide to get its troops and its weapons out of Donbass, those sanctions come off. And we can agree to disagree on Crimea, and American policy in Crimea is exactly the same as the American policy on the Baltic states when the Soviet Union seized them in 1940. And that's a policy we can and should live with. Last point I wanted to make concerns Nord Stream 2. I think that Professor McGregor and I disagree. Nord Stream 2, in fact, is opposed by a majority of EU states. Nord Stream 2 is opposed by the rising political party in Germany, the Greens. Nord Stream 2 serves as a geopolitical instrument for Mr. Putin to play with gas to punish the countries of Eastern Europe. But even more important than that, which is why it's against American interest in a vital way, Nord Stream 2 cements relations between vested interests in Germany and Russia. Those vested interests in Germany are already Putin-verstehers, justifying his aggressive policies in Ukraine and elsewhere. If you look at history over the past 2 centuries, you know that when Moscow and Berlin get together, that's not good for European security, American security, or especially for the security of the countries in between. So the mistake was made by Biden. It need not be irrevocable. Congress is strongly opposed. There is a decent chance that policy will be reversed. And certainly, if Mr. Putin continues aggressive policies post-Geneva, and maybe he won't, and I hope he doesn't, that would also be a reason to reverse that unfortunate decision. And I'm sure that Dimitri and Mr. McGregor will want to respond to me.
Well, let me try to respond very briefly, not to monopolize the conversation. First, John, as you know, I basically agree with you on Crimea. We may use somewhat different language, but I think we both can see same parameters of possible compromise. As far as Nord Stream 2 is concerned, I'm not going to become involved in this debate. because I am ambivalent about Nord Stream 2. It can work in a variety of ways. I think that this is one of those projects which is obviously good, or at least is perceived to be good for Gazprom. I am not quite sure whether it is fundamentally good for Russia, and I do not know whether it will contribute to the East-West relationship or would become a permanent irritant, where not only Russia, but also opponents of Russia would want to use this project, this pipeline, for their geopolitical advantage. But the fundamental point for me is George Washington and NATO. I know that what some people were saying when NATO was created and how they were misquoting George Washington. Because George Washington clearly was not talking about the United States confronting a near-apocalyptic threat, which was presented by the Soviet Union after World War II. That was not a situation George Washington could envision. So whatever was said at this time, I think is not terribly relevant to a current situation. And the current situation is that Russian armies do not threaten Berlin, they do not threaten Western Europe, they do not threaten Central Europe. We're talking about disputes which, from my standpoint, are peripheral in terms of American interests and questionable in terms of American values. And I think it's very important for us to be realistic about the nature of these issues and not to allow these issues to define US relationship with Russia, and more fundamentally, to contribute to an emergence of the Chinese-Russian alliance, which would be a real threat to American interests.
Colonel McGregor, would you like to jump in at all on this discussion?
Well, just very briefly, in defense of George Washington, I would like to say that Eisenhower took the position in 1956 that if we still had troops on the ground in Europe and NATO in 10 years, then we would have failed. He did not want a permanent commitment of that sort in that kind of alliance vis-a-vis the Soviet Union. I think the Soviet Union is gone, and that's my greatest concern right now. George Kennan once said around 1969-70, no one in Washington seems to know that Stalin is dead. My impression is that inside Washington, no one seems to know that the Soviet Union is actually gone. So we continue to treat Russia in ways that I think are self-defeating. As far as the natural gas business is concerned, I think we're going to see more and more Europeans that are going to do business, whether we like it or not, with Russia and China. I don't think they're going to sign up for the kind of hostility that we would like them to. I think it's a losing proposition. I also think we need to start talking to Germany and make it very clear that under the circumstances, if that's their approach, there is no particular reason why we should station forces in Germany. And by the way, when you go into NATO military circles right now, the joke in NATO is that there's only one force that stands between Russia and NATO today on the ground. That's the Polish army. That's it. There is nothing else. So we need to come to terms with reality of what people are prepared to do in Europe and what they're not. I don't think this problem is going to go away. We're not going to solve it by ignoring it.
Thank you. Dr. Lukyanov, do you want to jump in at all on this one, or shall we go to questions?
No, it's a very interesting and exciting American debate. I don't think up to me to comment on this. If I may, just one observation. It's not my duty at all to defend President Biden, but I think that this Nord Stream 2 issue, it shows that he has a slightly longer view than all of us got used to in recent years, because we used to react to current circumstances and try to present our reaction as a strategy. Biden believes, rightly or wrongly, it's not up to me to judge, that relationship with European allies, and in particular with Germany, is a crucial element for his middle-term and long-term strategy, not to just contain Russia, but I think to build up a new West against, first of all, China. Russia is part of this, but China is more important. Is he right or wrong? I don't know. It's not, again, not up to me. But I think he has very clear understanding that there are goals which might be more important than those who are demanded by media just now.
Thank you. All right, so let's go to the questions. And as a moderator, I'm going to exercise my prerogative and ask the first question. And I'd like to circle around to actually something that Ambassador Herbst raised in his opening remarks, and that was something that actually President Biden said in his comments at the summit, after the summit. He said after the meeting, he was asked whether he thought it was a success, and he said, well, we'll see, right? And so what I would ask all of you is, what in your view should we be looking for? What observable things should we be looking for specifically in the next weeks and months that would tell us, that would be indicators of whether or not this was a success or a failure, really? And in terms of your responses, I'd like to go in reverse order. So that would be Dimitri first.
Well, Sarah, thank you. I would have some fairly simple criteria. Ambassador Antonov and Ambassador Sullivan are going back to their jobs, Antonov in Washington, Sullivan in Moscow. Mm-hmm. And there was an agreement that not only they would be able to go back to their capitals, but also something would be done for both embassies, for missions, respectively of Russia and the United States, and the United States and Russia, which cannot operate normally because of expulsions, counter-expulsions, restrictions, and many people don't even remember anymore how all that started. I think if we're able to start normalizing the situation of the embassies, it would contribute not only to more comfortable conditions for our diplomats, but also it would contribute to a better climate for US-Russian dialogue. Because angry diplomats on both sides, it's not quite, if you wish, constructive in terms of addressing serious and complex substantive issues. Second, a very important agreement to start cyber dialogue. And the Russians were proposing it for many years, and the United States did not want to do it for many years. And as you know, because of your background and of George Bibi's background, you know that the United States had pretty serious reasons not to engage in this dialogue, because for this dialogue to be meaningful, you have to discuss very sensitive issues. You have to present evidence which normally intelligence professionals would not want to share with their adversary. But I also understand that this dialogue is difficult, but not impossible. That you cannot share everything. It doesn't mean that you should share nothing. And if this dialogue will start working seriously, I think it would be a major contribution to the relationship. These are two things that are complicated, but in my view, doable.
Thank you very much. All right, so next, Colonel McGregor.
Yeah, two things that I would look for. First of all, I'll be very interested to see how President Zelensky behaves over the next several months. Whether or not he approaches President Putin, if he does, what he approaches him on. Within the last couple of weeks, President Zelensky made a statement that really, really worried me. He said, who will rescue Ukraine? That's kind of really a terrible question to ask if you're the president of Ukraine. Ukrainians are the people who will determine the destiny of Ukraine, and only Ukrainians can rescue Ukraine. So I'm anxious to see what he does. That will tell us a great deal about what really resulted from this summit in a broader strategic sense. Otherwise, I think that Dimitri is spot on. But I'm not sure that exchanging ambassadors is important today as it was 50 or 60 years ago. People can pick up the phone, call directly. Heads of state can talk to each other very quickly, exchange information quickly. But I guess it's symbolic of the sort of foolishness that we've engaged in by not talking more directly more often. Hopefully that indeed will change.
Thank you very much. Dr. Lukyanov.
Yeah, actually, I very much agree with the colonel about the role of ambassadors. It's purely symbolic. So diplomacy in today's world, for good or bad, but doesn't play the role it used to play before. And I don't believe that beyond this symbolism, we can expect any substantial impact of returned ambassadors. I would agree that the key area which can generate added value to the relationship is cyber, because it's completely new field. We don't have anything there. It's extremely sensitive for both sides, and cyber insecurity was behind most of our troubles in previous years, and remains to be like this. And if professionals, both in America and Russia, will be able to start to find ways how to address, at least first on theoretical level, even not only in practical terms, but the scheme, the model how to deal with this completely new space, that will be enormously important, and that might create a different level of trust, or any level of trust, because now we don't have any.
Thank you. All right, Ambassador Herbst.
Thank you. I'm a little bit encouraged by what Mr. Lukyanov has to say, but let me explain that. There's no question that the major issue that was pressing on Biden heading to Geneva were those strings of cyber attacks coming from Russia in the preceding weeks. And Biden was very clear, delivering a warning that these things must cease, which is why I took heart from his performance in Geneva. Now, the Russian way, if it wants to make a retreat, would be to talk about some general process which can lead to progress in relations between the two countries, in this case, the United States and Russia. So to hear Mr. Lukyanov talk about this as a positive, to me, is encouraging. But so we just make sure what we're talking about. All this requires is for an effort from the Kremlin to make sure the cyber attacks on the United States cease. If that happens, that would be a concrete indication, a very important indication of this summit as a step towards better relations between Washington and Moscow. But what I'm saying about cyber applies to the whole host of issues which have, I think, defined the very poor relationship between the two countries over the last several years, starting with Moscow's war on Ukraine, which is not up to Mr. Zelensky to end, it's up to Mr. Putin to end, which he can do by simply pulling Russian forces and weapons out of Donbass, and all the other things which I don't need to get into. I think Dimitri, though, was smart to talk about the small things which we perhaps can expect as a result of this summit, meaning the return of ambassadors, an improvement of the situation of the embassies would be very nice, and also a symbol about something hopeful for the future, and maybe even a strategic dialogue, which all of us endorse, on potentially dealing with nuclear weapons and other weapons of mass destruction. So we have a lot to see. But again, let's understand that the best thing that could come from this event would be a ratcheting down of Kremlin provocations, which very much are cut against core American interests, even if those interests are reflected in out-of-the-way places like Ukraine. Although Ukraine, of course, is in the center of Europe, which is a continent which experienced 2 world wars and which has been prevented in the last 75 plus years, principally because of NATO. Thanks.
Thank you all very, very much. It sounds like cyber is a space that we all need to really be watching over the weeks and months to come. So we are starting to get some questions coming in. So the first that I have is for all of you. So this is a bit of a jump ball from Andrew Steinfeld. Were you all surprised by Biden's rather cool response to an action plan for Ukraine to join NATO? Does this reflect the reality that Ukraine will never be approved by other NATO countries? Does anyone want to grab that question first?
I'll give it a shot. I think what President Biden said was a direct result of President Zelensky's own goal during the summit. Zelensky, issued a statement or a tweet suggesting that a map was going to happen. Why he did that, I have no idea, but that was a serious mistake. So Biden was kind of surprised by that, and he had to respond. I'm not certain his response was the most artful one, but it's understandable why he said what he said. In fact, the position of the United States on Ukraine and NATO, the position of NATO on Ukraine and NATO has not changed in the past 72 hours. And it was essentially a position established at the Bucharest NATO summit in 2008, when George W. Bush made a push to get a NATO map membership action plan for both Ukraine and Georgia. He did it at the last moment, which of course was a very serious tactical error. He failed, but the compromise reached in Bucharest was, yes, the door is open for these countries to join NATO at some point in the future. NATO gets to decide this is not Russia, but point of fact, it ain't happening anytime soon. That was the subtext. And that's where we are today. So again, it was a mistake by Zelensky to put this on the agenda in ways that led to President Biden's remark, but essentially it's no news in terms of where NATO is. This does not mean that Ukraine will never enter NATO, but I don't think it's very useful to talk about this at this point in time.
Thank you. Another one, this one from
Hello, Andrew. Just saying hello to Andrew, with whom I worked on the Middle East a while back.
All right, a shout out to Andrew then. So another question, this one from Henry Now. So no one has mentioned the rotation of NATO troops in the Baltic states. If something happens, could that be a trigger for US involvement? Colonel McGregor, do you mind taking this one?
Sure. I think there are people that would like it to be, obviously. Would it be? That's a question that's tough to answer. We always talk about Article 5, but we have to understand that if something becomes an Article 5 issue, in other words, an issue for everyone in the alliance, there's no guarantee that there will be any unanimity of response. It's still a voluntary response by all the various members. I think we worry too much about it, to be blunt. I don't see much evidence for any imminent Russian attack or intervention there, or for that matter, against any NATO member at this point. But I don't think we know with absolute certainty or precision, despite the fact that lots of people say, absolutely, we will go to war. War is a pretty powerful word that we treat very cavalierly. The other thing is we have not done a very good job of explaining red lines. I think we should do a better job of that. I think Mr. Putin has explained his red lines, which goes back to something that Dimitri said earlier, and it's one of the concerns I have in Ukraine. There is a supposition in Washington that no one will challenge us, that we are so powerful and overwhelming that we can essentially bully anyone we want anywhere we'd like to on the basis of our so-called values. That is not going to go down well with Mr. Putin or Mr. Xi, and we have to be very careful about that. So I don't think it's a clear, unambiguous yes. I don't think it's a clear, unambiguous no.
Thank you. And here's a question from former US Ambassador to Azerbaijan, Rich Kozarich. Among the small things we could cooperate on is peace between Armenia and Azerbaijan. Any sense of whether that could happen?
I hope Fyodor Lukyanov could say something about that.
Yeah, thank you very much. Yes, indeed. Of course, the American role in relationship with both countries, the connection to Armenia, connection to Azerbaijan is quite important and significant. But I think we need to clearly see reality on the ground. On the ground, we have two powers, I mean, beyond Armenia and Azerbaijan, two powers which have a decisive role to play in the security arrangement and in the political and geopolitical prospect for the region. Those powers are Russia and Turkey. Russian position is quite clear. Russia is about to serve as a guarantor of new status quo, the status quo which emerged after the war in war 2020. And Turkish position is clear enough. Turkey is trying to enhance and expand its presence in all regards in the Southern Caucasus. So Russian-Turkish relationship there will be, of course, controversial and problematic, but we see that so far Russia and Turkey managed to find ways how to achieve working, short-lived but working compromises on their interests. And this is the key factor. Whether Turkey in this regard works as NATO member or US ally, I doubt, because they have a completely particular and special interest. So beyond this composition, yes, of course, US and maybe EU role can be applied, but this is a limited role.
Could I chime in for a minute?
Absolutely, please do.
Very briefly, in 1915, when Enver Pasha was the dictator of the Ottoman Empire, he chose as his first target Tsarist Russia and effectively marched in, invaded the place on the assumption that he could stir a revolution among the various Turkic peoples living inside the Tsarist Empire. His whole effort failed miserably and was stillborn. There was no interest whatsoever. The Turkic peoples at that point were not interested in being led into conflict with Russia by Enver Pasha. I think things have changed in the Caucasus. And that is not to say that I think Mr. Erdogan wants to be Enver Pasha, but I think Mr. Erdogan is genuinely interested in expanding his influence and power in the Caucasus. And I think this is a concern for Mr. Putin. And I think the danger of a Turkic uprising in some form or another over time, an uprising in the sense of a greater independence, autonomy from Russia and Russian interests is quite real. So I think we're going to see Russian troops, as we already are right now, thousands of them stationed in the region. I think that's only going to grow. And this will operate as a distraction on a strategic level for Mr. Putin in the future.
Thank you. The next one is from Bob Hormats. How do you think that China sees the results of the summit? This one, perhaps, Fyodor, do you mind taking this one?
Yeah, thank you. Chinese are very much following the whole Biden trip in Europe this time for very good reasons, because it's primarily about them, everything. I can imagine that Chinese are a bit concerned, because they used to be concerned when they see any any contacts between Russia and the United States, which are not utterly hostile, to put it in this way. At the same time, I think they know very well, and Russian side knows very well, that our relationship, for many reasons, are bound to be very close and very constructive. So Russia cannot afford to have bad relationship with such a neighbor, the biggest one and the most important one now for years and decades. It doesn't mean that Russia will not see challenges coming from China, but at the same time, it's very reasonable to take Chinese interests into account. And certainly Chinese will be very grateful for most detailed information from Putin about how it worked with Biden. And I'm sure that given the very private and intimate relationship between Putin and Xi, he will tell him a lot about how he found Biden, and this relationship will not be shaken by the summit.
Thank you. Would anyone else like to comment?
May I jump in?
Absolutely.
At the risk of annoying my American colleagues, the law of geopolitics suggests that Russia's main strategic problem is its very large and energetic and rising neighbor, China. It's noteworthy at this point in time when both China and Russia are challenging the American-led international order. And in fact, that's the only thing that draws them together, their mutual antipathy to American influence through this order. That even at this time, in small but unmistakable ways, the Chinese will let it be known that they have territorial pretensions on Vladivostok and other Russian areas in the Far East. A Chinese diplomat in Pakistan put that out publicly. It's been appeared in the Chinese press. Chinese academics write about it all the time. And we do know that the history of Russo-Chinese relations is a difficult history, which is normal, as especially Professor McGregor understands when great powers are neighbors. Eventually, China will challenge major Russian interests. Some people argue that it's an American interest to make major concessions to Moscow to draw to its sides against China. That's like saying we need to make major concessions to Mussolini to draw it to our side against Hitler, a century ago. The Chinese-Russian relationship will come a cropper without reference to the United States. And Russia will then realize it needs the United States more than the United States needs Russia. And we're already seeing the first cracks in the facade of their unity, although that unity will remain for some years to come, as long as, again, they're both fully on a revisionist course. Thanks.
Can I add something to this?
Absolutely, please do.
Okay, I think China is much more sensitive to us and more fearful of us than most Americans realize. And I have a somewhat different view of China's relationship with Russia. I actually see China almost as a clingy girlfriend who's very insecure and hangs on for dear life to the arm of Mr. Putin. So I think the Chinese are very, very concerned about some of the things that Ambassador Herbst just pointed out. But I think that the Russians are ultimately not as concerned about the Chinese as they are about Japan. And Japan is the real powerhouse in Asia, and not China. Certainly in a military sense, it's a towering potential superpower. I think Mr. Putin is very sensitive to that. Unfortunately, he's, I think, burned a number of his bridges with the Japanese over the Kuril Islands, which have made things very difficult for Russia. Maybe he'll reconsider, but thus far, I haven't seen any evidence for it. And finally, just to set the record straight, I am not a professor. I don't teach anywhere.
Yes, sorry.
That's all right. Worse things have been said about me, believe me.
You have a professor.
So let me also try to say something about that. I think that John Herbst said a lot of things which I would entirely agree with. And I think that there is a considerable apprehension in Russia about a growing Chinese power. And I think that John, you're absolutely right, saying that the Chinese, well, they don't always act as Russian loyal friends and allies. That is all absolutely true. And that's why I'm very hopeful that with smart and effective American strategy, the United States can avoid a Chinese-Russian alliance directed against the United States. At the same time, John, if we are creating an impression in Moscow that American objective is to change the regime in Russia, that American objective is to have an orange revolution in Russia, that an American objective is to punish everybody in the Russian elite who is perceived as not just close to Putin, but benefiting from Putin, and that is a major part of the Russian elite, then people will think less about long-term strategy. They will think about their immediate needs. And those immediate needs may push Russia against their better judgment toward China. That's how alliances were created before World War I. and I don't need to tell you what has happened as a result.
Dimitri, you and I sometimes do see eye to eye. And while I understand the United States must and will speak up for democracy, including in Russia, as you know, I am not an advocate for quote unquote regime change.
Thank you,
So I
John.
take your point.
Thank you to both of you. So I have my eye on the clock. And so we have time for probably one more question. And so I have this one from Lily Posner. One of the consequences of our tit for tat diplomatic expulsions is a reduced opportunity for people-to-people contacts. Is it in the Kremlin's interest to keep these contacts to a minimum?
Probably to me.
Yes.
Okay, first of all, there are different ideas in Kremlin and around Kremlin about people's contacts, of course. But I would humbly remind you that the biggest problem for people contacts now is not in Putin's or Biden's demand. So we lost most of contacts because of pandemic. And unfortunately, I don't see this situation to change soon. So due to all new versions of this virus and so on. So to a certain extent, yes, I think that all governments, including the Russian one, are actually considering this pause as something which probably might be of use for them. We saw before this crisis began that people-to-people contacts and other countries' interest for societies in third countries, other countries, provoked a lot of very negative feelings and insecurity, not only in Russia, but also in the United States. And in this regard, I don't think that after pandemic, who knows when, we will be able to return to the openness as we got used to. And again, it's not because of political will of particular governments, but because of completely different environment in which governments will try to regain more of control over societies than before. They will not be successful because it's impossible to impose full control, but they will try to do it again, not only in Russia.
Thank you very much. So I'm sorry to say that we really are coming up on the end of our time today. Are there any last comments that anyone would like to make as we wrap up?
Yes, and this goes back to what Dimitri said at the beginning when he started talking about long-term strategic interests. The problem for the United States in the 20th century has always been that we are preeminently a maritime and aerospace power. We are not a land power anywhere except in the Western Hemisphere. And like the British who preceded us, we have a habit of sailing in and meddling in regions and places. And then when things don't go well or they turn sour, we sail away, we fly away. In other words, our presence, wherever it is established on the Eurasian landmass, is inevitably temporary. And this, I think, is to some extent what Dimitri was getting at. It's something we need to think about. We are not a permanent presence anywhere but in our own hemisphere. Our interests may be global in an economic sense, but as far as global military hegemony and the use of land power, no, absolutely not. And the American people have no interest in it and don't support it.
Thank you very much. So this has been a fascinating discussion, and it's a topic I'm sure we'll return to many times as US-Russian relations continue to develop under the leadership of both Presidents Biden and Putin. I want to thank all of our panelists for a very lively and provocative discussion. I want to thank the audience for your excellent questions. I look forward to the next event, and a reminder that all of the events from the Center for the National Interest are available for viewing on its YouTube channel, and I encourage you all to subscribe. I know I have. So thanks very much for joining us today.
their